going to be a little bit more interactive than what I shared this morning. So just a heads up on that one. You definitely will want to have a pen and hopefully you have a note sheet. And let's bow our heads and pray together before we dive in, shall we? God, thank you for the chance to spend some time talking about this thing called marriage that you gave us, that is incredibly beautiful and infuriating all at the same time sometimes. Help us dig deep into the instructions you've given us on how we relate to one another as partners and understand the way you designed us to function according to your word. In your name we pray. Amen. So this morning we talked about some things that kind of set people up to have expectations that don't get met very well. In fact, they can be really painful and frustrating when you're expecting one thing and you discover that marriage isn't delivering. But I think the confusion about marriage, in my experience anyway, goes deeper than just unmet expectations. It seems to be a lot more difficult these days, frankly, to even have a clear understanding of what does it mean to be a man or a woman in our culture and our society. This is not going to be a lecture about the issues of gender identity. There's plenty of information out there that we're not going to get into. But I do think that it's indicative of something that we've struggled with for a long time. How do you know what it means to be a man in a marriage relationship or a woman in a marriage relationship? What are the expectations, the roles? How do we function together? And there's the way that we usually form those ideas and get at least a general sense of how it's supposed to work is we look at the people that have modeled it for us. And sometimes that's good, right? And sometimes it's not good at all. But that's what we have to work with a lot of times, is what we see in the people around us. How do they relate to one another as a couple? How do they decide whose job it is to do what? Who's the boss? Who makes the decisions? And how do we do this? And a lot of times those things are where we get a ton of conflict coming up. I always got a kick out of Garrison Keillor's signature line. Anybody remember Garrison Keillor? Some of you? No? The Prairie Home Companion? Okay, we got one or two public radio fans. He would always sign off his monologues about Lake Wobegon as the place where all the women are strong and all the men are good looking. It was a comedy show, of course, but just to play with the roles a little bit, our stereotypes, he would sign off with that line. But that humor taps into something that's true. Exactly what does it mean to be a man or a woman, and how are we supposed to engage with one another? And all the traditional signposts that our culture kind of gave us to say, this is what it means to be a man, this is what it means to be a woman. Those are gone. Those are completely wiped out. So even if you do decide to stay with a more traditional approach than maybe what you might find out there, it doesn't really help that much. Let me just dive into this for a second. And women, bear with me. But see if you can understand the difficulty that a man has trying to figure out how to relate to women in the culture in the last few years. Without a second's worth of confusion on the topic, women in our culture today can simultaneously be part of the Me Too movement and also defend the right of a woman to participate in the adult entertainment industry. Can you see the confusion that starts to come there? As men, we're not supposed to objectify women and treat them with negative stereotypes, and yet they want the right to be able to portray negative stereotypes or typical pornographic relationships, which are not at all typical of sexuality in the real world, right? They're idealized pictures of what a woman might do in a male fantasy. So it's a very confusing thing. Now, so we simultaneously criticize guys for being insensitive, boorish louts, and then we also make pornography available to them to enjoy with the click of a button. Now, women, been talking to you about how men are thinking, but I know you're facing impossible pressures as well. You live in a world today where the culture tells you that in order to really be fulfilled, you need to have a professional career, not just be a stay-at-home mom. But guess who still has to carry the bulk of the work after your 60-hour plus work week? And the home front. Right, because the guy isn't doing some of that stuff. He's still assuming you're supposed to be taking care of that. That's the way it's supposed to work, right? So the child care duties and the house cleaning duties, unless you've had a real sit down and said, hey, wait a minute, this isn't going to happen, sometimes that can land on a woman's shoulders in ways nobody was really expecting. So we're confused. And when you move beyond all the romance and all the wonderful ideas of marriage, that you get down to the day-to-day. We're just doing this thing together. We're living together. We're trying to get the work done. There's this really basic question that kicks in here on any given subject: who's going to be the one that leads and who's going to be the one that follows? There's two roles to have to figure out in almost every decision, particularly if there's any kind of conflict or difference of opinion. Who's going to be the one that gets to call the shots, make the decision, and who's going to go along with the decision that's made? And if you have subscribed to a more traditional context, well, particularly if you're a guy, we know the answer to that question. Who's in charge? Come on, ladies. Don't leave me hanging here. It's just that I'm not going to say it. Guys, who's in charge? We are. Absolutely. What my father used to say that the man is the head of the household, but the woman is the neck that turns the head. So there you go. Who's gonna handle the chores around the house? Which one of us works harder and deserves the right to kick their feet up when we get home for a few minutes? Maybe you get to all these questions and you say, couldn't we just go back to a time when it was much simpler? I mean, when this was the way it worked, right here. That's an actual ad for Van Heusen from 1950s. Now, of course, the women have had something to say about this particular subject in the intervening 60 years or so, and Van Heusen recently put out another ad, copying their previous ad with a very interesting little twist. So maybe you think that's the way it should work. You got it? Can you see it? Is it too small? That one came out in the 90s. So here we are as Christian men and women who are caught somewhere in the middle trying to figure all of this out. And so we turn to the Bible for guidance. That's as we should. And we find the passage that we're going to spend some time wrestling with today. It's a classic passage on the relationship between a husband and a wife. Ephesians chapter 5. I gave you the kind of the preview, and just a few sentences in, and you've got this incredible amount of debate on what Paul was actually meaning. So look it up with me, Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 through 33. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 through 33. And I'm going to read it, the whole section. We're going to spend some time here, so you may want to keep your finger here or keep your phone open to that particular passage. Ephesians 5, 22 through 33. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Then he goes on, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds it and cares for it, just as Christ does the church. For we're all members of his body. For this reason, and he quotes here, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Anybody know what he's quoting from? All the way back to Genesis. This is a profound mystery, Paul says, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. He also could be talking about marriage, which is also sometimes a profound mystery. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Now, have anybody ever heard a presentation or read a book on this passage before? Yeah? Some of you? This passage has caused more consternation in the church than just about any other counsel on relationship. Because depending on how you look at it and how you want to approach it, you can get some really, really interesting interpretations that can cause a lot of grief. It's all well and good if we could all just agree that the man's the leader, and women, if you knew your place and you submit to your husband and you did what they said, everything would work out just fine, right? You're not nodding your heads. I get the sense you don't agree with that particular interpretation. That really is the interpretation that is often shared in churches. That this says very straightforwardly, the man is the head of the house, and for peace to really function in the family unit the way God designed it, you should obey your husband because he's the head and you are underneath him. And they actually present the theology that says, well, it also taps into this. Christ is the head of the church. Well, who's the head of Christ? Well, God the Father is the head of Christ, and there's this hierarchy of the way this is all supposed to work. And if push comes to shove and you guys can't agree, guess who gets to call the shots? Well, that's the man, because the man is listening to Christ, and he's going to be a very spiritual person because he's following Christ, and so you should follow him. That's the way many people teach this passage is to be interpreted. I'm going to suggest to you there's a lot more going on here than that interpretation. So buckle your seatbelts. It's not so easy, by the way, just in case you did go with that, for the man to be the leader that they think they want to be here. This quote is attributed to Mahatma Gandhi. I can't tell you whether he actually said it, but I think it's hilarious, particularly if he's the one that said it. He said, "There go my people, and I must follow them, for I'm their leader." It's not so easy to be the leader when you got people who have their own opinions and want to do their own thing. How in the world are you supposed to get them to go where you want them to go? Let me ask the men here in the room today this theoretical question. How many of you, and don't raise your hands, have tried to solve the leadership submission thing by just manning up and taking charge and saying, this is the way it's going to be? Please don't raise your hands. You're laughing. Okay. I don't know if you have encountered this teaching in Christian circles, but there is a teaching that takes this idea and says, look, this is a biblical mandate, and you as the man are not doing your job as a godly husband unless you are keeping your family in line. And there are some who have taken it this far. This is a joke. But there are Christian groups who actually advocate that women need a good spanking from time to time in order to remind themselves and be reminded who's really the head of the household. This is not, I believe, what Paul is talking about here, just so you are understanding. Anybody who's watching this recording, we're not going there, but there are people who do. Now, as I mentioned this morning, I've been married for 30 years, and I was grateful to have a family who gave me some good modeling on being what it means to be married, and I can promise you I never even thought about trying this particular solution. My wife is smiling right now, and just because she knows exactly what would have happened if I tried. Bad idea. So now let me ask you another hypothetical question, men, because men are in the spotlight for this moment. You know, man up, be the leader and the head. How many of you have at least flirted with or tried the opposite solution? If you can't get him to do what you want by making sure it happens, how many of you have tried the option of, well, maybe I'll just go along to get along and I'll say, whatever you want, dear. Yes, dear. Anybody tried that one? Let's look, she's not doing what I'm telling her anyway. Let's let her be in charge and see how she likes it for a little while. And you know, I'm betting that there's the occasional moment in some of you ladies' minds where the thought, if you could do this, was appealing. You know, if you just do what I told him to do, everything would work out just fine. It can help you avoid some conflict for a while, because what's going on in the dynamics, we have to take into account That whether we like it or not, there is in our sinful reality a power dynamic that's at play here, right? And when it comes down to taking charge, men have an inherent advantage that isn't very fair. By biology, we have often been made to be the physically more imposing of the two between men and women. And men have used that to horrific advantage in many, many cases, right? So women approach a power dynamic in a relationship with the inherent understanding that they're never going to be able to use physical control. So this picture is really rather silly. It's just metaphorical. But am I right if I would say to you as women that you have your means and methods of managing power in the relationship? It may not be physically, but you have ways of exerting that kind of influence. Let me just take a simple illustration that it's not a big deal, it's not serious. Every one of you that is in a relationship or been in one, you've been here, this is the scenario. You decide we're going to go out to dinner. Done that? Been there? Raise your hands, just make sure you're with me. You've been in a relationship where you've tried to make this decision. And because you, the husband, you're accommodating, you're trying to go along, you want to make sure that she's wanting to go where you want to go, you ask your beloved where she would like to go. Where do you want to go to eat? And what is the response that you will almost invariably get back? He's smiling. What is it? It's all right. She, there's witnesses. She won't hit you right now. She'll hit you later. But I don't know what? Oh, yes, she does, doesn't she? Okay, somebody else give this poor man a witness. Has any other woman in the room uttered some version of that sentence? Okay, they're nodding. They're not willing to say it out loud. They're a little scared. And what's your response? You decide. And men, if you're dumb enough to believe her when she says, I don't know, you decide, and you suggest an option, what is the next thing that she's going to say? Huh? What? Well, yeah, it's not, oh, thank you for deciding. Thank you for making that suggestion. It's some version of, I don't know if I was into that. No, that doesn't sound good. And so you know how this goes, right? This ping pong goes back and forth a couple of rounds because your man genuinely wants you to be happy with the solution, and you genuinely want him to make the decision, except you don't want him to decide something that you don't want to do. And it's a difficult conundrum. And so you go around and around and around, and guess where you're going to go? You're going to go where she wanted to go in the first place, but she never told you. That's what's going to happen. Of course, you can always just throw up your hands and say, forget it, this is ridiculous. I don't want to fight this anymore. You do your thing, I'll do mine. We'll just cohabitate. And some relationships make that choice, don't they? They get to a point where I don't know how to work with you. You know, we'll sit down over meals and we'll be polite to each other. We'll live our own lives. And the cost, of course, of that choice is a loss of intimacy because you're not doing life together anymore and you're not sharing meaningful things. And you begin to lose love and respect. They're the things that get sacrificed. So this is where we find ourselves. We live together. We try to manage life, make decisions, all the while trying to still be in love with one another and not cause fights. So how do we manage to love and cherish and respect without ending up in perpetual combat? What does Paul mean when he says submit to wives, and husbands, he calls them to love? And to figure that out, we're going to have to dig a little deeper into Paul's discussion here, what he's actually saying. But first I want to give you a chance to personalize this, because we're going to be spending the next 30 minutes or so with this. And I'd like to hear your thoughts as we go along. So right now, you're starting to give me a little feedback. It's good. I'm going to give you more. I'm just warning you ahead of time, more opportunities. So I want you to take a beat and personalize this for a moment. You don't have to share the response that you come up with to this question. That's up to you. You can keep it to yourself, or you can share it with your spouse or your partner, if you're here, if they're here, you can choose to share it later. But I want you to process for a second, where are you at with this issue in your life right now? So here's the question. Do I have it on the screen? Where is this issue really showing up for me right now? Where we're struggling with this question of who's going to get to call the shots and how do we respect one another while having differences of opinion. Just take a moment and think about that. You think you got something? Tuck it away in your mind or write it down on the paper if your brain tends to lose things like mine does from time to time. I want to share one with you that I don't know how Robin's going to think about this one because it's been a long time. It's no longer a debate, but it was a debate at the time. Our daughter is now, she's 20, thank you. I was just trying to make sure I had the math correct. She's going to turn 21 this year. Growing up, she's a passionate young lady. It always has been. So her enthusiasms are intense. And she had some challenges periodically in school because she would come home talking about frustrations and things that were happening. And it was difficult to tell whether it was something that she had kind of initiated or whether the friend that she was having trouble with was part of the problem, or in a couple of cases, a teacher. And in one particular year, she had a real conflict that developed with one of her teachers. Now, Robin is a teacher, so she has some pretty strong understanding of the dynamics in the classroom. And so she has some strong feelings about how we should handle some of these things. And I was the pastor of the church, and the church school was associated, and I sit on the school board. And so I have interesting relationships related to all of this. And my daughter was the student, and the teacher, she claimed, was being unfair to her and was not treating her very nicely. And as we wrestled with that, Robin and I had a difference of opinion on how to approach it. And it was not a passing difference. It was a fairly strong difference of opinion. I felt pretty strongly that we should handle it one way, and Robin felt pretty strongly that we should handle it differently. And we had some pretty healthy debate on the subject, and occasionally we even disagreed. And so we wrestled through that, and that was where we had one of these moments where, okay, if I'm the man in the relationship, do I just take the time to let her share her opinion, but I'm the one that's in charge and my opinion should go? Or do I roll over and say, look, she's the professional in the field and I don't really know what I'm talking about when it comes to teachers and students and she should make the decision? Or do we have to somehow engage with this enough that together we've made a mutual decision? Well, that's not so easy when you have some clear perspectives that are going in opposite ways. I'm going to tell you that Scripture's counsel, and what Paul is saying here as we dig into it, here's the end that we're going to get to. The ideal and what Scripture teaches us is a mutual decision. But that's not so easy to accomplish. So how do we get there? I'm not going to tell you how that story ended. You've got yours. I just shared with you mine. Let's dive in. Let's look closely again at what this word submit is all about. And to be fair, we got to ask ourselves why it might bother you if it's bothering you just a little bit. To be honest, it bothers me. Just to be transparent, I grew up in a home where there was a lot of mutuality. There was also some challenge and dysfunction, and we were a normal family, if you can call a pastor's family normal. And I had I thought, a very healthy childhood in many, many ways. But one of the things that I picked up in the DNA of our relationship is that I have a really difficult time with men who want to use their physicality or their assumed and innate power to demand that somebody else do what they want them to do. I'd rather give up before I force somebody to do something. To the extent where being assertive can be a real challenge for me sometimes, to say, this is what I want. I'd rather not tell you what I want so that I'm not influencing your desires than to try to overwhelm you with my passions and my particular perspective. So that's just my DNA coming into a relationship. You know more about me than you were probably planning to today. So I don't want to be the kind of person that makes my wife submit to me just because I'm in charge. On the other hand, I really, really hate it when I don't get my way. I mean, I'm just telling you like it is. I'm selfish by nature. That's just who I am. So that makes me a bit manipulative sometimes, to be quite honest. That's my ditch, if you want to know. But it bothers me, and maybe it bothers you, if we don't have trust enough in the relationship to be able to work together to resolve the problem. That's the primary currency of a relationship, isn't it? It's trust. For those of you that have had small children in your life, you know that there is a certain period of time where they're old enough to get around and young enough to not realize you can't do certain things yet. You are still the hero in their world, and they trust you implicitly. My son and my daughter both went through that stage where they'd climb as high as they could get and then launch themselves at me without a second's worth of thought as to whether I was going to catch them or not, and say, "Catch me, Daddy." And that lasted until I wasn't ready a couple of times, and their trust got damaged. They figured out, oh, there are times when I can't always count on this happening. And that's a journey we all go through at varying stages. That happens emotionally to us as well, right? You meet somebody and you think that they're going to take care of your heart and your secrets and your treasures. And then they do something that breaks that, damages it. And it's hard to recover from that. So what happens when we start losing trust? Doesn't matter who you are. You may use different methods to accomplish it. But when you begin losing trust in a relationship, you compensate by trying to exercise control. Every one of us does it. It's the way we try to protect ourselves. When we feel vulnerable and insecure, we try to shield that vulnerability by taking control. And so, really, if you're following along in the notes, at the root of every power struggle in relationship is fear. What is this going to do to me? How am I going to get hurt? This is already hurting. How much worse is it going to get? What could happen to me if I don't stop this? And men, this is true for both genders. Women don't like feeling out of control any more than men do. They just deal with it differently. And so it doesn't look quite the same. So let's just process for a second. Everybody jump in here. How do men generally react to feeling vulnerable or losing control? What are some of the things that you see when that happens? Anybody want to just dive in there? What do you think? Withdraw. That's a good one. Sometimes we call it tactical retreat. What else? They avoid. Yep, that's good. Those are good ones. You both handle the more peaceful solutions that men will tend to use, but men aren't always peaceful, are they? Bingo. When men erupt in anger, it is often because they're afraid. And this is the way that's safe for me to show that, because if I tell you I'm afraid, you could hurt me. But if I react in anger or aggression, whether that's physically or emotionally, I can push you back from the territory that's making me feel nervous. Because when somebody comes at you, your natural reaction very often is to give them space, unless you're the fighter type that wants to dive in and get to it. And then that escalates the situation. But those are typical male fear responses. How about female fear responses. Feeling vulnerable, loss of control. How do women express that? Anyone? Cry. Okay, yeah. Emotionally responding with it can be genuine emotional response or emotional manipulation. Because if I can introduce emotion to the situation, the one thing that we know as women is that men are uncomfortable with emotion. Oftentimes. They don't know what to do with that. And so they tend to want to respond in ways that then can be used or managed, and it protects what you're afraid they're going to touch. So good. Emotional. What else? Anyone? You're thinking about something, but you're not sure you want to say it. Safe zone. Withholding what? You betcha. That was the next one on my list, as a matter of fact. It's a very, very honest and real way that women can maintain some sense of safety in the relationship. Because physical intimacy is an act of vulnerability, right? But women, more often than men, can realize they have incredible power and control over a man's access to their inner being by preventing access to their body. And so it's a statement of protection saying, no, I don't want you to go there because that's a place that I know you want something, but I don't have to give it to you. So it's a very good one. How about nagging? Sometimes men nag too, but it is often a territory that women are more comfortable in because it's a way of continuing to communicate your frustration. Make sure that the man knows, I haven't forgotten, right? Let me give you one that may be counterintuitive to you. This is one that I don't go there, but it's something I've seen more than once. How about helplessness? I'm not talking about genuine helplessness. I'm talking about an assumed helplessness. I don't know if I can do that. Can you help me? I just think I need somebody to show me how this works. I'm glad some of you are saying no. Sometimes women will use helplessness to pivot the anger and the aggression away from them. And it creates a safe zone. They know, you know, that if you can communicate to the person who is at the moment being aggressive toward you that you're vulnerable, not really vulnerable, but presenting as vulnerable, a good man will not take advantage of that and they'll step back. And it deflates the anger. It doesn't solve the issue, but it backs the man off. And so you are protecting that vulnerability by actually acting like you're vulnerable in an area that you're not. It happens. I'm glad if it doesn't happen to you, then that's not a thing, so don't worry about it. But one of the things that happens in that kind of dynamic, and we're going to be talking about the two oxygen lines of male and female relational dynamics in a moment. But when a man encounters a woman that he knows is acting helpless when she isn't, he'll back off, but he also loses respect. And he says, I don't think that she's an equal partner anymore because she won't be honest with me. Women have plenty of reasons why they lose respect from men as well when they get bullied over and controlled. So all of those are fear-based responses, folks. That's all protecting what I'm afraid of. Now, I want you to brainstorm for a second. Just think about it, and if you're willing, give me a hypothetical, not your own situation, a hypothetical scenario where a husband may be trying to lead and the wife is struggling to follow because he thinks he's supposed to be the leader. Where have you seen this happen before or you've heard about it happening? Give me a scenario. Buying a house, okay? Okay, so you got this scenario where you know you need to buy a house and there's a specific house you're looking at, but nobody's really saying exactly how they feel about the house.
You're both tired of looking at houses. I want to find one that looks like.
Okay.
And he thinks, I could live here, okay, I guess. And she thinks, well, I guess this wouldn't be too bad. Do you like it? Oh, yeah, I like it. You like it? Oh, yeah.
Okay, that's a good hypothetical. It can be an expensive one. I can give you a real story similar to that. When my in-laws chose to move to the area where we're now living in Coeur d'Alene, they started looking for houses and they wanted us to find a place where we could live and they could live part-time because they're moving from Southern California, do the snowbird thing. And we looked at a whole bunch of houses. The last one that we looked at, my mother-in-law had been on the property a grand total of what, 5 minutes? Maybe a little longer. And my father-in-law looked at her and says, "What do you think?" She says, "I love it. Let's buy this one. This is the house." We could never figure out why she wanted this particular house. And it took about 2-3 years later, she finally incidentally mentioned she liked the house because it had a split rail fence. True story. The house was not that great, but the split rail fence was apparently awesome. So there you go. It can happen. So, what are some of the kinds of things that might be going on, the fears behind that hypothetical situation that David's given us? He alluded to a couple of them. What were they? Yeah? Anybody? What are this couple afraid of? What do you think? They're afraid that they're going to make a decision that will make the other one unhappy. Okay, good. What else? Thinking about it. What do you think? You got something going on in your head again. You're not sure. Okay. Is it possible that they're afraid to share their opinion because they might find out that the other partner felt differently? It's interesting that both of them in that hypothetical scenario actually felt the same, but they were afraid that their partner might feel differently. So if I share something and they disagree, then we're going to have a fight. So I don't share what I really feel. Sometimes pride can get in the way. It's good. We have these challenges. What do we do with them? If we understand that the issue that we're dealing with is fear, a risk of what we're going to lose, it helps us start to understand what we need to do about it. Men will tend to want to minimize the risk by taking control. Puffing out their chest, being the man, doing what needs to be done. I got to step forward. Women will tend to minimize risk by some form of emotional interaction because that's where they have stronger skills. And so emotional manipulation, nagging, things like that are the temptations that go in there. So what's really going on? What I'm sharing here is really drawn out of some strong reading from a guy by the name of Emerson Eggerichs. Heard of Emerson Eggerichs before? Or the love and respect cycle? You're nodding your head. She recognized it before we even got started. Love and respect. He took a look at this passage and he looks at the end of the way this passage ends and he picks up something that a lot of people haven't really noticed. Look at verse 33. We read it, but you may have missed it just like many people do. However, each of you must also, he's speaking to the men, love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. That is an interesting difference in the text, isn't it? Paul is saying, husbands, you're called to love your wives. Wives, you're called to respect your husbands. Why not both love? Because Scripture's pretty clear. Even Paul is saying love is the biggest thing of all. 1 Corinthians 13, Love conquers everything. But he specifically uses two different concepts. Men, love your wives. Women, respect your husbands. Now, the way this sentence is constructed, Paul intends love and respect to be two equal concepts. Love is not more important and respect less, or respect more important and love less. They're both synonyms for the same concept that Paul is trying to express. But Egerich believes, and I'm inclined to agree with him, that what Paul is doing is recognizing there is an inherent difference in the way the genders express this same unconditionality of regard. That I value you as a person because you are you, not because of what I can get out of you. That you are a child of God and you are significant in my life. And he says, men have a particular language or way of experiencing that unconditionality that is different from the way women experience it. So let's unpack that for a minute and see if that bears up and supports the truth. This idea of one flesh means that women are offering unconditional respect and men are offering unconditional love. So that isn't to say that women or that men don't need unconditional love. All it is saying is that they process this unconditionality differently. So women need unconditional love, you can write that down, in order to feel validated and valued as a human being, this idea of coming in as an equal partner into the relationship. Men, on the other hand, need unconditional respect in order to feel the same thing. So let me see if we can put that in a graphic here. This is what we call the love and respect cycle, or the energizing cycle. And when one partner expresses what the other partner needs, it motivates and empowers their openness to trust. And fear is reduced, trust is increased, therefore the relationship has currency to work with. So when a woman offers unconditional respect to a man, she's increasing his trust level in the relationship. And when a man offers unconditional love to a woman, he's increasing the trust in the relationship. And so it creates this empowering cycle. So each builds on the other. And we'll talk about the inevitable question in a moment. Well, who starts? Do I have to go first? We'll get there. But first, let's understand the cycle a little bit more. When we're experiencing a power struggle in our relationship, it's a pretty good sign that what we're not getting what we need. So let's just continue on. And again, I'm gonna say that I'm going to refer to some of the typical stereotypes. I realize that each man is unique. These are functioning on large or broad stereotypes or categorical statements rather than each individual uniqueness. And the same is true for women. So when a man deals with conflict, the more natural or typical response that men have is what? Anybody give me the typical way a guy solves an argument. Doesn't matter who it's with. Lays it out logically. That's good. And if logic isn't working, where do we go next? Anybody? I throw my weight around, coming from the top up there. Yeah, absolutely. We use some of the resources that we have. And what we are going to say is, look, you're not going to push me around on this one. I know what I want and I know I'm right. How likely are two men who are having a disagreement to sit down over a hot cup of tea and talk out their feelings? Not likely, right? It's not the way we do it. It's not that it's wrong, it's just we don't do that. Now, here's the way a guy is going to solve an argument with another guy. They're going to keep pushing this around, verbally, physically, or otherwise, until one of them figures out that the other one has a better claim to winning. That can either be physically, I'm not strong enough to beat you, emotionally or logically, you've proven your point, I defer to your leadership. That's the way it works in guy world. It doesn't always look like fisticuffs, but the bottom line is we're all trying to figure out who the biggest dog in the room is, and the biggest dog gets to call the shots. That's the way guys think in general. Okay? And this is, women, why your man does what he does when you get into a disagreement, because he's thinking guy thoughts. David just pointed out that he's probably going to start out by logicking you. And he's going to try to explain why his opinion makes perfect sense and is the most rational. In fact, he may be even ungracious enough to suggest that you're being emotional about the subject. And if you would just calm down and think logically, you would agree with me. That's the point, right? That's why he's doing that. And if that doesn't work, that's why he starts to go to some of the types of physical communication that can happen sometimes where there's a little aggression emotionally or physically that comes out. And the point is, he's trying to get you, women, to admit that he's the bigger dog in the room, and you should naturally want to follow him because he's right and he can make it happen. So you should respect the one who's in charge. That's what he's trying to get. But that's not the way the women relate to this situation, do they? And I realize I'm talking out of my depth here. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. But with a man, the man thing is to have a good debate. And a debate for a woman in that context is a threat to relationship. And when a man thinks he's proved his point and he wants to move ahead, the woman feels what? Can you help me here? When I've laid it out all logically and I've explained to you why I'm right and you're wrong, women, how do you feel in that situation? Well, yes, they're obviously wrong. We knew that from the beginning. How do you feel? Defeated. Good. Do you feel heard? She's not. Wait a minute. What'd you just say? No, I don't feel heard. You feel very unheard. You feel like he didn't take the time to listen to what you had to say. You feel devalued, minimized, like your opinion doesn't count. And all of that adds up to the woman interpreting that experience as a less than loving response. I don't feel loved and valued in this moment. So the man isn't getting the respect because the woman's not giving in, and the woman, on the other hand, isn't getting the love that they need, and she starts reacting the way she needs to in order to communicate to her man that he is just really, really screwed up. She gets disrespectful in some way because, and this is one of the things that really illustrated to me the power that we understand this idea even more than we realize we do, because we instinctively go to the negatives. Men will tend to start acting in unloving ways, and women will start acting in unrespectful or disrespectful ways. Because, why? We know it gets their goat. When I don't feel like you're giving me what I need, I'm going to take a shot at you. And I do it in the way that hurts the worst, because I know how to get to you. And that's what we call the crazy cycle. When a man isn't receiving love, a woman, isn't receiving love, she starts to get disrespectful, and when she gets disrespectful, the man starts feeling disrespected, and he gets less loving, and so on and so forth. And you could start it the other way around. When the woman is not feeling love, she gets, anyway, you get the point. This is called the crazy cycle. So men, I want to talk with you just for a minute, just the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of us in the room. And I want to see if I can give you a sense of what your wife is trying to tell you when you reach this point and you're in the crazy cycle. And women, you feel free to either agree with me or contradict me, because I realize I'm a guy and I may not know what I'm talking about. Guys, when you feel like you're being disrespected and threatened, this is part of what's going on. Your wife is trying to shout at you as loud as she knows how, "You're not hearing me. You aren't valuing and loving me." But this is the best way that she has in her tools. So if you feel like she's resisting your lead and your logic for some reason, guys, there's a reason why she doesn't trust your lead. I don't know what that might be, but what you need to know is that she's afraid of something. That's what she's telling you. She may not be using words, those words in particular, because that would make her vulnerable and give you a tool to use against her. So she's not going to tell you, "I'm scared." but that's what she's feeling at some level. And when you and I as men try to solve the problem by logically showing how she's wrong, or we bluster, or we demand, or we press ahead with our own wisdom, she will either push back with the weapons that she has at her disposal, or she may just completely turtle and walk away emotionally, if not physically. I clearly have no participation in this decision, and she's telling you, I don't feel loved or treasured or protected, and so I'm doing what I can to communicate that to you. Probably in the not so helpful a way, but she's using what she has. Let me ask you if you've ever played with something that looks like this. Anybody know what that is?
Chinese handcuff.
Yep, the Chinese handcuff or finger trap. And it works off of a very simple principle. Once you put your fingers in there, the more force you apply to try to pull out and get loose, the harder it grips. And so you can't get out of the trap without giving. I wish I had one here to actually model it. But the whole idea is that the solution is counterintuitive. The more trapped I feel, the harder I want to pull. I should have had you bring it if I'd have known. So this is the solution that Paul is trying to offer to the problem of submission. He's trying to help us understand the problem isn't to exert more force from one side or the other. The solution is to give. Let's see how he does that. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 23. I want you to look that up because this is where we think the passage starts. Paul is very clear, 5 verse 23. Paul is very clear that the husband is the head. He doesn't make any argument about that. He states it very categorically, and we think we know what he means when he says that. For the husband is the head of his wife, as Christ is the head of the church. He is the Savior of his body, the church. So husbands, if you're trying to lead out in your home and it doesn't seem to be working out, then you need to look at how the passage actually begins in verse 21. Paul doesn't start with, wives submit to your husbands, verse 22. He starts the section in verse 21. What does it say there? Somebody find it and read it for me. This is where Paul begins his section, and that changes things a little bit, doesn't it? Everything else in the rest of this section is commentary on that principle. This is one of the great one another's of the Bible. And Paul's statement is submit to one another. This is where he begins. So let's map that out for a second. What happened to my map? There it is. He says, submit to one another. So wives, submit to your husband. And then he says in verse 28, husbands, love your wives. Submit and love are parallel concepts. So you could easily say, wives, love your husbands. Husbands, submit to your wives. That changes things a lot, doesn't it? Because the overall concept is mutual submission to one another. Everything else is Paul explaining in gender-specific concepts how we do that together. So let me catch up with, get my computer to quit arguing with me here. The clauses actually in the original language are dependent on one another, so dependent that there's no verb in verse 22. Verse 22, wives, submit to your husbands. That word submit, it's not in the original language. The word that should be there and is in verse 21 is hupotasso. The Greek for submission, and used in a non-military context, it means an attitude of giving in or cooperating and assuming responsibility or sharing a burden mutually. That's the way it gets used in the Greek language. And in verse 21, in the Greek, it says, submit to one another. In verse 22, it just says literally on the screen, wives, to your husbands. Paul borrows the word from the previous sentence in order to carry on the thought. So that's why we can say confidently that these things are all related to that first phrase. In Greek, it works perfectly well, and that's okay. You don't have to worry about it. We just know that in English, that sentence doesn't make any sense. And so the translators rightfully picked up the verb from the previous sentence and put it in there so that in English we would get what they were saying. In Greek, they don't have a problem with that. So when we hear the word submit, in our mindset, we tend to think of a hierarchical relationship, right? My wife is here, so I'm going to use this illustration. Her brother would hate me telling this story, but she will love it, actually. She told me of times when she was fight with her younger brother, and there was a period of time where she was old enough and strong enough, bigger than he was, that she'd pin him. And no, this was your brother that would do this? Maybe I got this. Anyway, one of the two of them would pin the other, and then they would let a little bit of spit form, and then let it start to dribble down. Have other people done this, perhaps? And then they'd suck it back up. And the whole purpose was, I got you. Say uncle. All right? This is what we do to each other as kids. This is not at all what Paul is talking about. This is not about who gets to make the other one knuckle under. This is a one another command. Let me walk you through that. Look at your note sheet for a second. I want to just quickly give you several of the other statements in the Bible that use this same structure, this idea of one another. These are some of the things that you're going to see. John 13:34, love one another. Romans 12:10, be devoted to one another. 1 Corinthians 16:20, greet one another. Galatians 5:13, serve one another. Ephesians 4:32, be kind and compassionate to one another. 1 Thessalonians 5:11, therefore encourage one another. 1 Peter 3:8, live in harmony with one another. 1 John 3:11, we should love one another again. Now, is there any question in your mind that it is expected that both parties being addressed in the one another are supposed to do the same thing? Any question there? The point is, two people at least, or two groups of people who are all encouraged to do this thing, whether it's love or live in harmony, encourage, be kind and compassionate, or submit. It's a mutual command, a one another. And it's all done in the context of a relationship to Jesus Christ. So this idea of submission keeps us moving in mutuality together. Biblical submission is an interdependent relationship. It's an interdependent relationship, which means that hierarchy doesn't exist. That together we're working on the same goal. So any hierarchy that does show up is parallel to this idea of interdependence. Instead of positional authority, then, an interdependent relationship relies on other things to function as we decide who's going to do what. Recognition of inherent authority or trust in fundamental goodness. This is why we have a problem with this concept, because we have trouble with trust. We have trouble with believing that that person, that other, has my best interest at heart. And we're suspicious that maybe they're actually going to harm us. But let's say that we do choose this path of mutuality and interdependence. How do we then deal with the idea that we're going to get stuck in this perpetual little circle of no, I insist, you first. No, you first. And nobody ever takes the leap. And we're sit there at the threshold of whatever it is we're trying to get through, and we're all mutually submitting to the other to get their butt out of the way. That's not the point either. So how do we get out of that? Well, let's talk about what Paul says in this passage and break it down. He says three things to men in particular, for husbands first. He says, you're the head. Again, that's not hierarchical, that's interdependent. But if you're the head, what do heads do in an interdependent relationship? They go first. Well, that doesn't sound very fair. What do you mean? And before I go further on that, guys, let's just deal with something. What if, whatever the issue is, the fight you're having, what if you know for certain that it's her fault? That she's the one that messed it up, that she's the one that's wrong, and you're right. Does that make a difference? No, it doesn't. Even if she's wrong and you're right, guess what leaders do in an interdependent relationship? They go first in trying to resolve the problem. That's what leaders do. When they choose to submit to the one who is wrong first and say, how can I serve you? It changes the dynamic of the relationship. Now, how can I say that and maintain a straight face and sanity? Ask me what Jesus did with human beings, and I'll tell you why I can say that. Was Jesus right and humanity wrong when it came to sin? Every time. And yet, what did Jesus do according to the gospel? He condescended. He chose to come from heaven, to take on life like us, to live our lives, and to die. And he was right. I was wrong. And he chose to submit. Leaders go first, just as Christ loved the church and went first. That's what Paul's saying. And there's no exception in that command. If you love your wife the way Christ loved the church, well, then you get to go first. You can't make her do anything. You can't force your wife to do something. She's going to have to choose to do that out of her relationship with Christ. So unconditional love means that I can give her that grace even when she doesn't deserve it. Verse 25, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church, gave himself up for her, made her holy, cleansing her by the washing of water through the word, to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. Jesus went first. That means as a leader, I go first. In all that it means to step down and to sacrifice. Number 2, godly leaders show power on their knees. This is number 3, actually. The first one was submit together, if you were writing it down. Mark 10:45. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. We're not talking here about retreating and say, fine, whatever, you win. So how do we serve our wives when we're in this struggle over who's going to get to win? Here's 2 suggestions for you, and I'm talking to the men here in particular, but it probably applies to both. Listen for more than just the words. All of your insistence on logic is not going to do you too well here because the heart is coming into play. What is your wife saying when she's not saying it in words? I can tell you as a guy, I have been more frustrated when I feel like I'm not getting the whole story, when she's holding back on me, and she's not telling me what she's really feeling. She's making me guess. Drives me nuts. I have discovered that if my wife has to tell me what she wants, it doesn't count. Right? I'm supposed to get it. I'm supposed to guess. Folks, I'm glad she's here to hear me say that I admit that this is not just her contrariness or manipulation going on. That's not the reason why she's doing that. What she is asking for is, are you listening to what's really going on in my heart? Are you slowing down and processing this with me instead of just trying to get me to tell you so that you can take off and deal it yourself? I want to do this together. So take some time. Slow it down. Listen, process it. there are less than a handful of decisions that you will ever make in your entire life that are so time sensitive that you can't take the time to process it and to pray about it together and to listen. And again, I'm speaking to guys, you've already done this for yourself. Guys will be doing this in their head. They'll be processing it. They don't talk it out loud all the time. They've worked it through. They've thought the pros and the cons. And then they come and they say, well, this is what I think. Well, if you did that, wouldn't it be okay if your wife had the chance to do that too? But you've already done it. She should just take your word for it. Well, wouldn't that be nice? And maybe sometimes she will. But in this particular time, she's afraid of something and she needs to work this through before she's as confident as you are. So if you're going to lead, take the time to slow down and process it and do it on your knees with the true leader for both of us, right? We're all submitting to Christ as we submit to one another. She's going to have some of the same questions that you had. That's what it looks like to serve your wife in love and to submit mutually, even as you're leading as God has called you to be the head. My wife gave me this is actually a friend that gave me a beautiful illustration of this. It didn't happen to be between a husband and wife. It happened between two brothers. He recently lost his brother just over a year ago, but before his brother died, they used to love going on motorcycle trips together. They'd go on 2 or 3 day back road adventures all through northern Idaho. You know why they love that. I mean, it's beautiful. They'd ride, they'd find a spot to camp, and the trouble would always show up in the morning. My friend is a pretty organized, we need to get on the road, we got things to do, places to go, people to see. And his brother would get up late, putter around, and act like he had not a care in the world, and just take forever getting his bike, gear packed up and on his bike and ready to go. And my friend said he used to drive me nuts. I decided that rather than attack my brother for his frustrating behavior, his relationship meant more to me than being somewhere on time, by my time frame. And so I decided that I was going to have a book ready, and I'd get ready, and then I'd just sit down, and I'd read my book until my brother was ready to get himself together and actually get on the road. He took the time to let his brother be who he was, and he made the changes in himself rather than force his brother to be somebody different. Now, I don't know whether his brother ever got any better about getting on the road. That's the way we like that story to end, right? As guys, I gave these things to you so that you would get your act together and start doing it the way I want you to. I have no evidence that ever happened in this particular scenario. And men, if you're doing what God is calling you to do, to mutually submit in your relationship, I can't predict that your act of supreme sacrifice is going to change your woman in any way, shape, or form. It might not. That's not why you're doing it. You're doing it because you are serving your wife out of reverence for Christ. We can talk about how you can communicate effectively of things that really matter. This is a case where it didn't matter. Sometimes it does, and there are ways you can communicate through those things. But when it doesn't matter, we submit together, we serve first, and we show power on our knees. That's how we show unconditional love for our wives when we are as heads. Ladies, can I share some things with you? Again, with full understanding that I'm speaking from the outside of the club. It's just some observations. I would suggest that when you submit, as you are called to do, submit assertively. Now, I know that doesn't seem to make sense on the surface, but the two words actually go together biblically. Submit assertively. Paul's saying submit to one another, and he's challenged wives to submit to their husbands. And women often struggle with that because they say that's going to make me weak. It's going to make me inferior or subverted to my husband's wishes and will. So men compensate with getting angry and forcing, and we've already talked about that. Women compensate with the tools that you have at your disposal, which is the emotional set. And you're much better at it than men usually are. You've been doing it all your life. This is the world, the pond you swim in. You understand emotional language better than men do. While they're out there on the playground beating on one another and doing other physical things, you're hanging out with your girlfriends and you are talking about things and you're discovering the pain of emotional manipulation from the mean girls, right? Women know how to hurt other women in ways that I just can't even begin to imagine. Guy go out and just thump the other guy. You guys, the pain goes on for years as that emotional impact continues. So you've been trained to know how to use those tools. You've been in this scenario. You can your husband, your boyfriend, he can tell you're upset about something, and he asks you what's wrong, and what do you say? Man, that was quick. Nothing. I mean, hey, can we just have a shout out for the guys just real quick? The guy at least noticed you were upset. That's a small victory. It's a small victory, but it's a victory. And you say, nothing. And he knows it's not true, and you know it's not true. But you want him to care enough to know you well enough to say, oh, it's this. And he would love to guess correctly, I'm telling you. But he doesn't even know where to begin. Now, we've already said biblical submission is not about subverting your opinion and to say whatever you want, dear. But it does mean choosing to reject those tools of emotional manipulation and say, well, if you can't guess, then you don't deserve to know. So that's what I mean when I say submit assertively. Not aggressively, but assertively. Be willing to believe your man when he says, I don't have a clue what's wrong, would you please tell me? And say, and trust that he's not asking this because he's an idiot. He might be an idiot, but it's not because he's clueless, it's because he genuinely doesn't understand the language as well and the things that you naturally are functioning in. If you're willing to say that and your husband is following the instructions of Scripture, it's safe for you to admit that because he is already coming to you with a heart of submitting together. And if you are willing to be transparent about what's really bothering you, he can treasure that rather than abuse it. But that's the risk that you're taking as you come toward the middle of submitting to one another. Share shoulder time. Women, have you ever watched a group of guys hanging out and wondered what they were doing? Because it looked like they were all just sitting around doing nothing? That's exactly what they were doing, is sitting around doing nothing. And maybe one or two of them were doing something, and the rest of them were all kind of sitting around, and they had some kind of drink in their hand, or they were, and they were talking. And if you ever ask them what they're talking about, what is the inevitable answer? Nothing. Now, this is one of the core differences between men and women. You ask a woman what she's thinking, and she says nothing, it means that she wants you to guess what she's really thinking. A woman asks a guy what he's thinking about, and he says nothing. He's really honestly thinking about nothing. Now, women, I know you don't believe me. You're looking at me and saying, no, that's not true. It is true. You don't believe that that's possible because you're always thinking about two or three things together. Guys aren't wired that way. They can genuinely sit there, and the biggest thought in their mind is, that's it. And you're saying, no, I know you don't believe me. I'm just asking you to take it on faith and trust that genuinely they aren't always processing things. They aren't thinking. They can think about deep things, but oftentimes when they're sitting there staring off into space, they really aren't. They're actually doing brain break. Their brain's on vacation for a second, and that's how they're resting for the next onslaught of challenging issues that they're going to deal with. How does that relate to this? Well, when guys are hanging out together, and they're out there around the car tinkering, or they're sitting on the porch and they're doing nothing, they're actually doing something. They're communicating mutual respect for one another. And if you don't understand what I'm saying, let me see if I can explain. For guys, to have another guy think that they're worth spending time hanging out with, that is a sign of respect. And you don't have to do anything together. You don't have to prove anything. You just have to be willing to show up and be there. And the stuff that comes out during those conversations wasn't planned, and it happens, and it comes, and it goes. But it's a sign that you care enough to give time in a guy way, which is shoulder to shoulder. When you want to share with your girlfriends that you value their time and their input and their presence, you do it face to face. You sit down with something to drink, or you sit down in the living room and you get close together and you start talking together. And sometimes you're talking over the top of each other and you're going back and forth and you're excited, or you're sitting quietly and maybe both of you are crying. And if your guy looks in on you, you say, "What in the world? Are you guys okay?" "Oh yeah, we're fine. We just I don't get it." You're connecting and you're sharing unconditional love for one another. Your natural language. The guys are sitting there doing the same thing in their natural language with unconditional respect. We don't have to get anything done. We don't have to prove anything to you, or whether I'm better than you. I'm just here hanging out. We didn't talk. What did you talk about? Nothing. Because we didn't have to. We're together. Now, this is something I haven't told my wife that I was going to do, but I think she's going to be okay. If not, I'll hear about it later. My wife made a choice. And I doubt that she actually processed it quite in these terms, but a choice that was incredibly meaningful to me. She's had a really, really busy week. She actually spent the first 2 days of her week on the East Coast doing a training to administrators for a union in educational tools. She got back crazy late on Tuesday night. She had to teach the next day. And I said, "I'm going up to Bonners Ferry to do this thing on marriage, and I don't know if you want to come or not." Often she'll travel with me, but sometimes she stays at home. She's an introvert. She needs her me time. She came home on Friday and she said, "I think I'm going to go with you. We haven't had a lot of time together, and I'd like to just have the drive time." That's what she was saying for her. Whether she knew it or not, she was saying something to me. She was giving me unconditional respect, because she sat here for a total of about 2 hours listening to me pontificate about things that she could sit there and say, "Yeah, well, why don't you do that at home?" Hopefully, we've been a little bit more honest and transparent, and I'm not an expert. But she didn't have to listen to this stuff. She's heard this before. She's giving me unconditional respect by her presence. She's just hanging out. And that means an incredible amount to me. It's fuel in my emotional tank, because she took her time to be with me. So that's what shoulder time looks like. Jump in the positive direction. We've already established, women, that you have a better emotional intuitiveness than men typically do. And you spend a lot of your time in life trying to figure out what other women are thinking about you and about situations, and you're intuiting these things, and you're wondering, and you're guessing, and you probably got a half a dozen different lines of thought going on at any one time. And you don't believe us when we say we're not thinking that way, which all that adds up to means you are really, really good at forming conclusions based on intuition. Now, men can be intuitive as well, but women tend to do very well in that area. They don't always, however, guess correctly. That doesn't prevent them from jumping to that conclusion that they've formed in their minds, because you're really, really good at pulling all of those threads together. And when the threads connect right, it's very useful. When they connect incorrectly and you guess wrong, well, that's really damaging, isn't it? So I'm not telling you not to jump to conclusions, because you're going to jump to conclusions. You were wired that way. Just practice jumping in a positive direction rather than the negative one. That's what mutual submission looks like. When your guy does something that you are looking at and saying, "Well, why in the world did he do that?" The natural conclusion might be, there he goes again, being a goofball. And it's entirely possible that that's true, because we do have a demonstrated history of being a goofball sometimes. But you also have the choice to say, I wonder if he was doing that for a positive reason. See, you have that choice. Rather than to disrespect the motivations by assuming negatively, you can start with a positive assumption and then work to explanation from there. That's what Paul is saying when he says, show unconditional respect. Marriage is complicated, and as we close today, I want to ask you to think back on that scenario that that issue that you said, this is a place where this feels like it's living in my life right now. And I want you to think back, if you're a male and you've been listening to me here, ask yourself, how do these three things impact this situation? What would it look like if I employed submitting together, going first, and showing power on my knees? Take that scenario that you're working with. Women, what would it look like if you started submitting assertively or sharing shoulder time and jumping in the positive direction in that situation that you've got in your mind? And I'd like you to say, okay, here's one thing that I am willing to do leaving here today in my relationship that I've been thinking of. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to try it and see what happens. So I'm going to give you a couple seconds to think about that, and then I'm going to close my presentation, and I want to open the floor for some questions for a few brief moments before we wrap up. I hope you found something that might be useful for you. I don't want to belabor things too long, but we'll give you a few moments. If something I said made you say, could you talk more about that? Or I'm confused, or I'm not sure if I agree with you on that. Where'd you get that from? Take a couple questions. Well, I would love to believe that everything I said was so clear and so effective that there are no questions, but I suspect it may be more the case that you're tired and you're ready to go home. And that's just fine. Yeah.
Just a comment. Thank you for saying what you said. There are times when I just am not thinking of anything. And it's hard, she can't believe it. Cannot believe
I'm glad you have a takeaway from this particular seminar. That's wonderful.
It must be something that you don't want to tell me.
I'm,
Wasn't thinking of it.
I'm happy to give you some cover there, brother. Are you willing to share how long you guys have been married? 6.5 years. So you've had a couple of times at least where that question has gone between the two of you. So just to follow up on that for a minute and to give you the opportunity, Nico, when you're asking that question, what are you really asking for? If I could give you the opportunity to kind of say, this is what I want.
I always think that he's thinking deep about something, and I'm curious about what he's thinking.
You know what? Let's just keep that impression. That's a very good impression. And when he says nothing, what he means is it's just so deep I haven't figured it out myself yet. No. Well, let me suggest other women, when I've asked that question, have shared this and see if this connects with you. That women are asking to be included emotionally. You know, I see that you have something going on over there, and I want to share life with you. And so I'm just asking for you to let me inside whatever little circle you got going. And so it's natural for you to assume when he says nothing that what you're saying is, I don't want you in here. He generally is thinking about nothing. It's true. So, but, you know, maybe David, as you're hearing that, and I know for me, as I started hearing that from my wife and other women who would share that with me, it helped me think of different responses than just nothing. You know, and to try to find ways of answering the question that was being asked, even if the words weren't saying it. So listening emotionally or intuitively rather than just to the words themselves. So just a couple thoughts. Yeah.
And another thing, too, is this later sometimes they'll circle back around. And it'll trigger it, and it'll tell me what he's thinking about. But if I pressure him at the moment,
Nope.
push her back.
It's not coming out.
Can't stand nothing.
Thanks for sharing that, both of you. Appreciate you being willing to share that little bit with us. Anybody else?
I was married for over 50 years, and it's very true that a lot of times you're not thinking anything. But my wife, that was not what she wanted to hear.
Very disturbing, very disturbing. In full disclosure, Ed and I have a family connection through marriage. So when I was much, much younger, I remember traveling to their home and meeting them as distant relatives. So it's been a pleasure to get a little better acquainted as an adult now. So Ed's family, I claim him. But it's far enough away he doesn't have to claim me if he doesn't want to, and that's the good news. That's wonderful. Anyone else? Any other comments or questions or thoughts? Austin.
So in your analogy, I don't know if I forgot the mic, but your analogy or story with the two brothers,
Mm-hmm.
The one had to just accept that the other wanted to take his time. But in that brother taking his time, it was, relatively inconsiderate of the other brother and the plan to leave.
Yes?
So it's kind of a tension between preferences and interests. So in a marriage, where is, I'm not sure how to exactly word the question, but what is the balance between letting someone be who they are, but then also how can maybe a spouse still encourage that development without trying to kind of micromanage the development?
It's an excellent question, Austin. How do we can't just let it go, which is the solution there, and that was legitimate for them. If we need to resolve it, how do we do that? You could invite me back for a whole other seminar on communication skills, and we might do that sometime, but here's just a very short snippet. There are two related skills that I teach in my premarital counseling classes. It's the primary thing that I do. The other stuff builds on top of that and is all practice to use it, because everything rests on your ability to effectively communicate with each other, particularly in conflict. And this is a conflict. You have one set of expectations and desires, and your partner has another, and they're meeting head to head. The illustration of getting ready and leaving on time is often an issue for married couples, because for some reason we marry people with different opinions about what it means to be on time or late. It just happens. And it's so how do we communicate through that if we can't just let it go? The two skills, I mentioned one of them, is for women, is in the context, but it's true for men as well. Be assertive in communicating what's going on with you. And then the other skill that is necessary in order for assertiveness not turn into a fight is active listening. Because let's just assume that if you're doing this in a conflict situation, there is emotion and tension related to the subject. You care. You're worried about what might not happen. You're worried about how it's impacting you. You're frustrated. You're hurt. You name the emotion. These things are swirling in the midst of this. The way that we keep emotions from taking over is by using these two skills. We communicate assertively and we listen actively. Communicating assertively is communicating what's going on in you in a clear and a non-attacking way if possible. So the formula that I teach couples to use, and they hate it, and I say, I don't care, do it anyway, because you'll get better at it, and when you learn how to do it well enough, you can do it differently, but you'll still be doing it. And it's a formula. When you fill in the blank, whatever it is that your partner's doing that's ticking you off, I feel, how do you feel? So when you do this, when you say this, when you don't do this, when you don't do that, when you aren't saying that, this is how I'm feeling about that. That's communicating assertively. You're not saying this is what you're doing to me. You're saying this is how I feel about this experience. So that takes risk, right? To say that I'm opening up my heart and showing you why I'm hurting. And you know that your partner could abuse that and say, well, that's stupid. You know, why in the world do you feel that way? That is not active listening. That would be the opposite. So active listening becomes the skill of hearing what is being said to you and making sure that the other person hears that you've heard. That's the active part. So what I'm hearing you say is, and then repeat what you heard without using the same words. And it's important that you don't just parrot back the same words, because that's really irritating. Don't just feed that back, but say, okay, so this is what I'm hearing, and what you're doing is you are providing an interpretation of how it came out and came across to you. And there's a couple things that are going to happen. You could have missed what they were trying to say. And so it'll help give them a chance to clarify what they really said that you couldn't hear because you were also upset and filtering it through your anger and your hurt and your frustration. So it slows the conversation down and keeps the tit for tat from building. But it also does something else. It gives the gift of listening to the person who's being listened to, because the first time they say something, they may not say it the way they really wanted to say it. They maybe don't even know exactly how they're feeling. And so they take the risk of, blah, there it is. And when they hear it come back to them, they say, no, that's not how I'm feeling. Well, that's what they said. But because you took a beat and you were willing to reflect back to them actively, this is what I heard you say. You're not saying this is what you did say. You're saying this is how it came across to me. They can then have the benefit of saying, wow, that is not what I meant to say at all. And they can rephrase it. And so they can take another crack at assertive communication, and you can take another crack at active listening. Until the universal sign that you got it is never, yes, that is correct. Almost never. It's always, yeah, or silence. Then you know you've actually heard what's being said. Now, that isn't the end of the process, it's just the beginning. Because you can't resolve a conflict until you know what you're really fighting about. And when you start fights that turn hot, you're almost never fighting about the thing you're really fighting about. You're fighting about the stuff that lives on top of that thing. So active listening and assertive communication helps us dig down underneath and say, oh, this is what we're really talking about. Gotcha. And then you can begin to work on resolving the conflict through some specific steps. Just before we end that one, this very short snippet of the communication seminar, the thing that you need to know is that that's supposed to work both ways. So that if you're both willing to process together, once you've given the gift of active listening and you've been your partner's been assertive, then try to take the time to swap that around. And if both of you are partnering in that, as even in the tension, you can say, well, so how are you feeling about this? You know, you've been listening to me, but you clearly have an opinion on the subject. And then you do in reverse and give the gift of active listening and assertiveness and own. You remember the story that I told this morning about going to the counselor and finding out that I was part of the problem? I've been trained in this stuff since college. I am an expert in teaching communication and in pastoral counseling, for whatever that means. I grew up in a home where the tools of active listening were used not only constructively, but also defensively at times. Without trying to come off sounding too prideful, I'm really, really, really good at doing this. And the reason that I'm saying that in this context is not to make you think that I'm smart, is to illustrate to you that you can be so good at doing something that you can use it as a weapon. And the reason I was a problem in my relationship is that whenever we would get into a fight, which happened from time to time, I would immediately go into pastor mode. Was that what you called it? Something like that. And I would use these tools to use them on one side of the equation while never revealing how I felt on the other side. I was never willing to be assertive about how I felt. I always kept her at a distance when everything got hot because I didn't want to continue the fight. I wanted to defer in order to win. Because as long as she didn't know how I really felt, I could do whatever I wanted and just work around her. And she never had a real person to have a relationship with. She always had an illusion, a front. And through that journey of counseling with the counselor, which, by the way, in my case, took me to some very interesting places that I will not share with you. Just suffice it to say, there was some very deep damage and woundedness that I kept protected, hidden behind this facade of being a good listener, which meant I never had to show up and actually be in the relationship. And slowly, over time, I learned how to risk showing up. And I got good enough at it that one time she got mad at me for not agreeing with her and being assertive. She doesn't remember that. I remember it very well. We've since learned how to balance our assertiveness, and we're both firstborns, which is a little unusual in the relational diagrams that you often see. Firstborns marrying firstborns is often a recipe for conflict because we know how to be the ones that set the pace. And we've had to learn how to function within this context of mutual submission because I solved it by faking it that I didn't care and that I was just all about her, but she never knew how I felt. And then we had to learn how to work it when I actually started showing up and saying, no, I do care. And this is what I think. And this is the way it's going to be. And then we learned that, no, it was going to be slightly different than that. So that's the journey, just to be transparent with you, of how you begin to you can use these tools as weapons, or you can use them as genuine revelations of being who you are and trusting one another. So I don't know if that's a very short version of a much longer seminar that we have a lot of fun with. But in case there's one more, we'll take it. If not, we'll wrap it up. One more comment, one more thought. Let's pray together. God, it's been fun. Thank you for the opportunity to hang out with this group, to talk about the instructions you gave us and on how to have a marriage relationship and work in harmony with the way you treated us, to live in submission to one another, to use our leadership the way you use your leadership, and to show unconditional love and unconditional respect as we need in order to build the relationship trust that we have in our lives. God, I know this is not easy. I've been open enough so they probably have an idea. I'm not done figuring this all out myself, but I do know enough to know that it works and that it's a blessing, and I pray they will have the courage to build trust with one another and start giving one another that mutual submission in you that